it's Neil from PepperDash again, and I help develop products including Essentials. Today, we'll talk about how to load a plugin into Essentials. If you haven't already watched the previous video where we introduced plugins, I highly encourage you to go watch that first. Let's get started. In this video, we'll discuss the plugin loading cycle, how and where to load a plugin, how to edit your configuration file so you can instantiate devices from a plugin, and some helpful console commands that'll make your life a lot easier. It's pretty important to understand the process of how plugins get loaded. So let's take a look at that right now. So from the main GitHub page here, we're going to go to the wiki. And then from the wiki, we are going to navigate to the plugin page on the navigation bar here on the right. And you can read this, the documentation on this page yourself, but I'm basically just going to give an overview of this drawing. So what happens is the Essentials application starts and it's looking for a specified folder structure. It's one of the first things it checks for. We have some folders that are used for storing IR files or smart graphics, SGD files, or plugins. So if that folder structure isn't present, we write it to disk and basically stop because we don't have a configuration file to load. If it is there, then we're going to look in the plugin folder. And if the plugin folder exists, we are going to take any DLLs we find and we're going to move them into a temp folder. And then we're going to unzip any CPLZ files and take all of its contents and move it into a temp folder. So then we're going to iterate all the DLLs in that temp folder. And first thing we're going to do is check if we already have that DLL loaded. So maybe it was part of the Essentials framework already, or maybe another plugin loaded that same DLL already. And if it is loaded, we just skip to the next one. If not, then we actually look at all the C types in the assembly. So C type is a Crestron version of the .NET type. And basically that means all of your classes. And so we're going to iterate through all those and we're going to see if any of those implement iPlugin Device Factory. And if they implement the interface iPlugin Device Factory, we're going to perform a minimum version check. So basically this is the protection to make sure that if you have a plugin that relies on something in Essentials version 1.5.0, that somebody trying to run and load that plugin to version 1.4.0 that doesn't have the thing that you need from 1.5.0 won't load the plugin. So if it passes the version check, then we're going to call this load type factories method, which we'll get into later. And that's going to actually load the types and the factory methods into the device manager. So once this is done, once we've iterated all the types in the assembly, we would iterate to the next DLL. Once all the DLLs are done, then we proceed to reading the configuration file. And now we're going to treat this just like loading normal devices. We're going to iterate the device collection in the configuration. We're going to read the device type property, and we're going to go see if that type property matches a factory definition in the device manager. So if it's found, we find the factory for it, then we use the factory to build the device. And if the device needs a control device, so say it needs a COM port controller or a TCP/IP client or an SSH client that implements the iBasic communication interface, then we'll build that as well. That'll get added to the device manager. And otherwise, we instantiate the device itself, add it to the device manager, and we register any pre or post activation actions. And then we iterate to the next device. So now that we've done this quick overview of how plugin loading mechanism works, I do recommend you dive into the documentation. There's lots of helpful details for you, and you'll get a better understanding as a whole. Now that you understand how Essentials loads and processes plugins, let's take a look at how we can load an actual plugin. So from the PepperDash organization in GitHub here, we do have an example plugin here, this Panasonic display.epi. So if I click on this repo, what we can do is we can look, there is a release 1.0.1 here. So we can click on that release link and we can download this zip file which contains all the binaries for the plugin. And I've already done that. So I'm going to open up FileZilla here. And so here's my folder where I extracted the DLL file. And I'm connected to my RMC3 processor here. So if you want to follow along, go ahead and connect to your processor in FTP here. And in the user folder under program 1, which is where I have my essentials loaded, and it's created my folder structure here for you like we showed in the flow chart, there is my plugin folder. I'm going to take this CPLZ file and I'm going to load it to the plugins folder. And now, just for clarity here, now that that plugin is done loading, I am going to reset my essentials program running in slot 1 here. Basically, this is going to, as we showed in the flowchart, start up essentials, unzip this CPLZ, grab the DLLs inside, and try and load them into essentials. So we'll just wait here while it loads up. And here we go. So we can see we're running version 1.5.8 of essentials, and also see we're running version 1.0.38 of PepperDash core. And sometimes the console can be a little slow to update here. There we go. So it's showing all the factory types that are built into essentials, and now it's showing that it found the CPLZ. It's unzipping it. And once it unzips it, it's going to attempt to load all of the types in the plugin. And in this case, it's going to find our new display types. So there we go, all loaded up. So it's as simple as that for loading a plugin. And what we can show here is if we do a get types console command, if I can type, and I'm actually going to filter this. You can add any text after get types and it'll filter your results. It's going to show that we have several types that contain PANA. In this case, you can see that we have Panasonic display and Panasonic TH display. You can see the actual C type, so this is handy because it shows you the namespace, the fully qualified namespace of the class. This is your clue that it came from a plugin because this namespace is from the plugin. And then there's a description as well that can be populated. You'll also see here that there's another one at the bottom, this third entry, Panasonic THEF, that actually was part of the Essentials framework itself. So if we were to want to instantiate any one of these, we could take this type name and put it in our config file and instantiate one of these display classes. And that's what we're going to do next. Now that we have our plugin loaded, let's look at how we can modify a configuration file to instantiate a device from that plugin. So if we go back to our program 1 folder here, I have the one of the example configuration files loaded for the Huddle VTC1 type room, which is basically a huddle room with a single display that has video conferencing and audio conferencing capabilities. So what we can see here, once the FTP folder loads, is I've got this configuration file here, which I have already pulled down. And so here in the configuration file, inside the devices array, we have our display. And you can see that this is configured for a Samsung display right now. So I'm just going to change the name. And the only other thing I'm going to change here really is this type value. I'm going to go look at the console command we ran previously. I'm going to repeat it again here so you can see it a little clearer. If I can type the word types properly. And this is going to get me the types containing the letters PANA. And I am going to copy that type value, and back in our config editor here, just going to paste that there, get rid of the single quotes that it grabbed. The only other thing I'm going to change is inside the properties block here, the Samsung display has an ID property because you can ID the Samsung displays individually if they're part of a video wall. Well, we don't need that for the Panasonic display. You could leave it here, but it's best practice if you take it out. So what I've effectively done here is simulated what would happen if, say, we had a room with a Samsung display that failed for some reason and needed to be replaced, and we couldn't get a Samsung replacement, so we have to put in a Panasonic. So that's a real-world application here where you can just swap out the display, and say the version of the program didn't have the capability for the Panasonic display. Well, we loaded a plugin, and now we can load the display from the plugin. I'm going to leave the control section here alone. We'll just assume that this is being controlled the same way as the Samsung and that all the settings are the same. So I'm going to save this file, and I'm going to go back to FileZilla here. And I'm going to load the changed file when it prompts me. Away it goes. And then I'm going to go back to our Toolbox console session here, and I am going to reset the program, and it's going to load the new configuration file. And since we've already loaded our plugin, it's going to try and grab that device type from the plugin. So while Essentials is starting up here, we'll take a quick look, and I will show you that since we previously loaded the CPLZ the last time I started the program up, what we're going to see inside the plugins folder is we're going to see that the CPLZ is gone, and now there's a loaded assemblies folder that's been created. And inside this loaded assemblies folder, pardon me, we're going to see the DLL for our plugin. So over here on the left, Essentials is starting up now. We'll just give it a second to do its startup business and load the configuration file. Sometimes the console gets a little stuck. Okay, so it's all loaded there. And just to confirm that we were successful, we're going to use a console command called devlist. And what this does is list all the devices that have been added to the device manager. And what we can see at the very top, we have a device with a key of display-1, and it is a Panasonic display. So now we can tell that we successfully modified our configuration file, and we've swapped out the existing Samsung display for a Panasonic display that actually came from the plugin we loaded. Now that we have our program loaded and we've got our Panasonic display running from the plugin, let's take a look at some handy console commands. So let's go back over the get types command. So get types, by default, if you don't specify any additional filter text, it's just going to return all of the types that the running program has loaded. So this is all the types that are included in the Essentials framework version you have loaded and any plugins that have been loaded. So there we go, literally from A to Z in alphabetical order, all the way from Apple TV to Zoom Room. So that's a handy one if you're trying to figure out what the value of the type property in your configuration should be to instantiate any particular device. And like I said, like we did before, if you add any text after get types, it will filter that command to learn the types that match your filter string. So another really important one when dealing with plugins is you might need to know what version of a plugin is running. So there is a console command called report versions. And report versions is going to go out and get all the DLLs that are loaded in the application. It's going to return the versions of all of them, so we can see that all the versions of the Essential Framework are at 1.5.8. PepperDash Core is 1.0.38, and our plugin down here is 1.0.1. Now, all of the Crestron DLLs, unfortunately, we can't actually get the versions of at runtime. In 3 series. In 4 series, we can, but these really aren't all that important since they're all built into the plugin anyway. But this is really handy if you're debugging and you're trying to figure out why something's behaving differently. You can check the version of the plugin that's loaded this way very easily. You can find these helpful commands and more in the Essentials GitHub wiki. I strongly recommend you explore the documentation and play with these commands with your own processor. Also, you can use the console command help user, and it will list all of the user added console commands right in your console session for you. So today we showed you how to load an example plugin into Essentials. In the next video, we'll walk you through how you can create your own plugin starting from the Essentials template plugin repository. As always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon for notifications of future videos. And consider coming and checking out the conversation on the Essentials Discord server, where you can talk to other developers that use Essentials every day. See you next time.